I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Mark McCoy of the Manchester University Psychology Department. Dr. McCoy teaches and does research in the areas of cognitive neuropsychology. He's originally from the Michigan and lived in Toledo, Ohio when he completed his doctoral work. He's been in Indiana since he received the opportunity to teach at Manchester University. He has taught Introduction to Psychology, Cognitive Neuroscience, Cognitive Psychology, and Statistics and Research. Dr. McCoy is married and has 3 sons, ages 10 to 13. Outside, 10 to 3. Yes. We're not going that way, we're going the other way. 10 to 3. Outside of working and being a dad, he spends time following Detroit sports, and with his wife spent much of the last month consuming as much of the Olympics as they possibly could. He enjoys reading, watching movies, and has a personal goal of running 500 miles this year. Please help me welcome Dr. McCoy.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. I'm excited to come and talk to you all today. I thought I would really talk about 3 main things today. I wanted to tell you a little bit about who I am and a teensy bit of how I came to be in the Manchester community. I want to share with you some things that I like to talk about with my students, some of the things that seem to get them the most excited. There's some of the things I'm the most interested in and passionate about, and it seems to be that they tend to resonate with those things. And then I want to tell you about some of the research project, or the one ongoing research project I have with some students and others that I'm hoping to do in the near future. So to start with, who am I thought I would show you some pictures of my family. Right here, this is my oldest son, Lucas. We just went to Florida this January, so we got some pictures from us in our time at some different theme parks there. So this is my son, Lucas. He's 10 years old. This is us on a Star Wars ride. We went to Super Mario World. That's my middle child, William. He's 7 years old. And that's my 3-year-old being held by Chewbacca there at a Disney park as well. And then I got 2 pictures of my wife and my whole family up here. My wife would hate that I have the picture of her snuggled up in the blankets. You can see my 3-year-old in that picture is terrified. We were watching the movie Home Alone, and he was terrified of what was happening to everybody in the movie. And then we went as all the characters from SpongeBob for this Halloween. My kids always pick what we go as, and we all go as a big group. We live in Warsaw, Indiana, just about 20 minutes away. I'm sure you all know that very well. We have a bunch of neighbors that we dearly, dearly love, and I also love many of the people that I've gotten to know in Manchester. But I also wanted to tell you just very briefly some things about how I came to be interested in psychology and kind of some of the background in education that I had that brought me to Manchester University. So one of the things I always tell my students is that one of the reasons to study psychology is because as a human being, more or less all of us are amateur psychologists, right? We're all really deeply interested in what other people are up to, why they make the decisions that they do, right? Whether or not it's somebody we'd like to date or marry, right? Why did they say that? What did that mean when they said that, right? If we're being interviewed for a job, why something happened, right? We're all really interested in why other people do things, and we spend a lot of our time trying to figure those things out. The route that I took to deciding to study psychology was I started at Oakland University, which is in Michigan. I originally started studying biology, and I really enjoyed biology a lot. But one of the things I was much more interested in research. So originally I'd been thinking medicine, and then I was like, no, I really love research and academics. And I was kind of bouncing back and forth between biology and psychology. I ended up finishing both degrees because I really couldn't make up my mind. And then eventually I met the man who would go on to be my master's advisor. His name is Todd Shackelford, and that's his wife, Viviana Shackelford. They both teach at Oakland University. Todd is what's called an evolutionary psychologist, and that means basically the framework that evolutionary psychologists use is they say, hey, there's this kind of fundamental theory that like helps explain all of biology, which is evolution by natural selection. Maybe we should think about how that fits with humans too. So that really got me interested in psychology and kind of got me moving in that direction of, well, maybe this is a framework that I can be really interested in. So I ended up doing a master's at Oakland University with Todd. Then I went to Bowling Green State University in Ohio. That's a picture of their psychology building right there. It's a pretty imposing building when you see it. It's like very windowless on the top. It's kind of strange, but I spent 6 years there. I had a great time there. I made a lot of friends that I'm still close with today. And we actually have two recent psychology grads who are in their PhD program, both in their IO psychology program. One is the daughter of Sam Rohr, who teaches in business, and the other is, her name's Hannah Thompson. Her father was involved in the university for many years, I've been told. But anyway, at Bowling Green, I started studying more of the neuroscience side of psychology, and that was really what my PhD was in cognitive neuroscience. So over time, I developed this interest in studying emotions. Usually when I tell people that I'm interested in emotions, they say, well, why are you interested in emotions? They seem really complicated and messy. And part of the reason that I'm interested in talking about emotions, at least, even if aside from just studying them, I found this image online. Most people tend to think of emotions as being the opposite of thinking clearly, right? So in this graph, right, this isn't a scientific graph, right? But on the x-axis, right, it says strength of emotions, and on the y-axis it says ability to think logically, right? And so this person is showing that the more emotional you are, the less logically you can think, right? That's what they're trying to portray here, right? And this is a pretty commonly held belief by people that our emotions cloud our judgment, our better judgment, and cold, hard logic would lead to us making the best logical decisions. One thing I often teach my students about is how there's this part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex. Sorry, that's a little pixelated because I blew up the image a little bit, right? It's part of our brain that's kind of right above and nestled around your eyes. One thing we've learned from neuropsychology is that when people have damage to this part of their brain, it actually makes them terrible at making decisions. But what the orbitofrontal cortex actually does is it connects emotions to our ability to make decisions. And the people who have this type of damage to their brain, to their orbitofrontal cortex, often find themselves in this kind of like logic circle where it seems like they can never come to a decision, right? And something as simple as, would you like coffee or tea? Well, tea has a lot of positives, right? It's not as much caffeine as coffee, right? There's a lot more flavors I could get, right? Coffee, is better in some ways, but tea is better, and they just kind of end up in this never-ending loop of going back and forth between the pros and cons, right? So the orbitofrontal cortex kind of brings a little bit of emotion into our decision making, and when you go, I feel like coffee today, right? Part of it was that your orbitofrontal cortex was, for whatever reason that day, just deciding coffee sounds better today. So what is an emotion, okay? This is kind of a stale definition of emotion, but I'm going to build on it a little bit. An emotion is a natural, instinctive state of mind deriving from one's circumstances, mood, or relationships with others, right? The key element to pay attention to here is this state of mind piece, right? Emotions are a state of mind that we find ourselves in, right? Unlike that image I showed you, which kind of puts it that emotion and logic are like as opposed to one another, emotions are just different states that we find ourselves in based on things that happen to us, right? So they inform our decision making, they don't cloud it, right? Something else we can say just very generally about emotions is they can have something called a valence, right? This is basically how much we're experiencing an emotion. I also like to talk about how emotions we typically classify emotions as being positive or negative, right? The positive emotions are things that we generally want to seek out in our life. Things like happiness, love, amusement, and satisfaction are things we want, whereas negative emotions, right, are things we don't want, right? We don't want to experience fear or anger or stress or disgust, so we try to avoid those things, okay? Now, the view I'm going to take with you today is that, or a view that I'll share with you of mine, is that it's foolish to say, well, we only want these and we don't want these, right? Emotions are just different states that we find ourselves in, right? There's nothing really at their core that is better about them or not, right? The view that I take in thinking about emotions is that they all help us, they all serve purposes depending on what has happened to us, okay? Something I love to share with my students, and they often find this to be very surprising, but I always tell my students that that my favorite psychologist is actually Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is of course most associated with biology, but he would have called himself a naturalist. But I often argue that Darwin performed what I think may be the very first psychology experiment ever, and Charles Darwin was actually most interested in the emotions. Around the time that he published Origin of Species, right, which is about evolution by natural selection, it was starting to become easier to take photographs of people. It still wasn't very convenient, but it was easier than it had been. And so Darwin had a friend who was sharing with him all of these images of people who had had some type of facial paralysis, and they would manipulate those people's faces into different expressions. And Darwin thought this was fascinating, and he would share them with people, and he would mail them to people all around the world. He had friends and colleagues all around the world, and he would ask them to share them with people and see if they could tell what types of emotions were being displayed on the faces. These two right here underneath the picture of Darwin are images of people experiencing disgust, right? So Darwin was interested in seeing if people around the world could recognize the same types of emotions happening on the faces of people that were living in England at the time, right? And generally that was what they found, right? That people all around the world, no matter which country they were from, could recognize a smile as being an expression of happiness, and they could recognize a facial feature of somebody having a scrunched nose and their lips curled up, right, as being disgusted by something, okay? So my view kind of comes from this my view of emotions kind of comes from this joint appreciation of this evolutionary interest in emotions and this idea that they help to serve a function, but also a neuroscience perspective. So the cognitive neuroscience and evolutionary perspective on emotion is one that says that a cognitive state is one that results from some change in information, behaviors, and thoughts, okay? So a very clear-cut example of this that probably will not take anybody by surprise, right, would be if you imagine that you saw a bear, okay? The evolutionary and cognitive framework would say, okay, when you see a bear, the most appropriate response would be fear, because you don't want to be attacked by this large, powerful animal, right? So you're going to go through a set of changes to help you deal with this situation, right? You might change your immediate motivation, right? Maybe you were interested on, eating a meal, maybe you were having a picnic, or you were taking a nice stroll through the woods when you saw the bear. Now your motivations need to change. So your emotion of fear is going to help motivate your change in thinking, right? You're going to pay attention to different things, okay? It's going to change how you attend to things in your environment to best fix this state that you find yourself in. It's going to change how you gather information, right? You're most likely going to a fight or flight state. You're going to be taking in a lot more information, right? Especially about the bear. What is it doing? You're going to be thinking, does it see me? Is it going to maybe charge at me? What's the immediate thing? Should I start screaming, right? You're going to have physiological changes, right? Your heart rate is going to increase. Your eyes are going to dilate. Your breathing is going to increase, right? You're going to be ready to do something quick if you need to get away from this bear, right? You're going to have these behavioral changes about deciding what you should do, and then you're going to be learning from this awful moment, right? It's going to be further cemented into your memory of how you got out of this moment, how you dealt with it, right? So all of these types of things, considering all of these things, how do all of these changes that a person might go through, how does this help them deal with this moment, right? This this big example is an example of this view of thinking about emotions and what they actually serve, okay? So, having said all that, we can now orient ourselves a little bit more to one of my favorite emotions to talk about, which is disgust, right? Whenever I tell people that I think talking about disgust is very interesting, they always look like they think I'm crazy, right? But I find disgust to be a particularly interesting emotion, right? It's an emotion that we don't want to experience, but it is, at its heart, quite easy to understand why it's so useful, right? So the very basic definition of disgust is a feeling of revulsion or strong disapproval caused by something unpleasant or offensive, okay? It's a very negative emotion. We don't like to experience disgust, right? It's not something we want to experience. So this tends to motivate a lot of behavior that means making us experience the emotion less, okay? So if you experience disgust at something, right? Like let's say, imagine you just, pulled something out of your fridge and, you opened a container and you smelled something that didn't smell very good, right? It's going to change how you pay attention to the gross thing, right? Your motivation on potentially eating the thing is going to change now that you've smelled that maybe it smells a little bit funny, right? The type of info that you're interested in is going to change, right? How long has this been in here? When was the last time I touched this? When did it get put away, right? Maybe we learn a little bit about the thing, okay? Oh, I shouldn't have put that in there for so long. I shouldn't have put that in the back. I should put stuff that can spoil closer to the front of the refrigerator, right? Cognitively, you're going to be thinking, I don't want to, this is gross. I want to get it away from me. And then you're going to make a behavior decision of trying to get rid of the disgusting thing, right? You're going to throw it away. You're going to make sure you don't accidentally try to consume it again in the future, right? Because it smelled so gross, right? It's giving you a sensation, a feeling of this is not something that I would like to encounter again, okay? From a neuroscience perspective, we can talk about how disgust is involved in the brain, right? So on this slide, or on this image on the left side of the slide, I have kind of the standard image of the brain with the 4 lobes, right, of the cerebral cortex, right? The occipital lobe, which is associated with vision, the temporal lobe, which is associated with hearing and storing information, the parietal lobe, which is associated with how our body feels in any given moment, and the frontal lobe, which is associated with us making decisions. However, neuroscientists also talk about another part of the brain that's pretty close to the outside of it, but it's not quite on the outside, which is called the insula, or the insular cortex. And sometimes this is referred to as the 5th lobe of the brain by cognitive neuroscientists. So the way you would actually see the insular cortex is if you were to fold open this portion of the brain, there's this little fissure. It's called a fissure. It's kind of the gap between the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. If you were to open that up, you would see your insular cortex. That's where it would be, okay? This is it from a side view, and then you can kind of see a different angle of it here. And normally you wouldn't be able to see that part of the brain at all. One of the things that the insular cortex does and why it's so involved in disgust is the insular cortex connects the physiological experience that we're having with the sensations that we're experiencing, right? So when you smell something that smells revolting, right, or you see a piece of food that looks gross, maybe some bread that has some mold on it or whatever, I apologize if that's disgusting, but, right, it gives you that like, ugh, I don't want to touch that thing, I don't want it near me anymore. Partially your experience of that is your insular cortex is kind of giving you the sensation of, or it's recognizing that you're consuming this would be bad for you, okay? And so if the idea of eating it is revolting to you, it's because the idea of eating it makes you imagine how sick you would feel. And that's kind of what your insular cortex does, is it's responsible for trying to think, okay, my body something bad would happen to my body if I consumed this, so I don't want to consume it, okay? So that's more or less what the insular cortex does. So it's very important in disgust, because if something seems revolting to you, you want to avoid it, the insula has most likely played a role in making you feel that. A little bit more information before I start getting to some research that I've done with some students. This knowledge about how we feel disgust and how it motivates our behavior led to the proposal of something called the behavioral immune system. The idea of the behavioral immune system is that when we're out in the world, there's going to be a high risk that we're going to become infected by something, right? So generally in psychology, what we would just say is, many things that could infect us, right? Maybe it's spoiled meat, for example. We would say that thing would have high pathogen load, or it contains pathogens, something that could make us sick. So we really don't want to encounter it. However, we're also going to encounter things in the world that are non-infectious, right? Things that won't make us sick, but oftentimes it's hard to tell those two things apart. So this idea of the behavioral immune system is this idea that we should be really sensitive to things that can make us sick. And it really is less important that we tell these two things apart, just that we can tell what could make us sick. So oftentimes, as human beings, we overestimate the types of things that can make us sick, and we treat all things, even non-infectious things, as things that could potentially make us sick, right? So we may actually see something that could make us sick, or we might just think it could make us sick, and it leads to us wanting to avoid that thing, okay? It makes us want to keep the thing away from us, right? And so this could be food, but it could be a sick person, right? So if a person who appears really sick approaches you, there's very strong evidence that it creates a very similar response in your brain as if you were encountering some gross food, some gross spoiled looking food, right? So a few years ago now, I did a project with some students where we showed people images like these. These weren't the exact images we used, but these are like what we showed people. We showed them pictures of people who weren't wearing a mask and pictures of people who were wearing a mask. And this was at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic when we did this research, right? Wearing masks became suddenly much more common in the United States of America. And in general, what my students found was that people rated the unmasked person as being friendlier, more desirable, more approachable. And they even said, yeah, this person seems more like I would rather be intimate with them than, somebody who's wearing a mask. But interestingly, one of the questions we asked students was, how scared are you of the consequences of catching COVID-19, okay? So students who were the most scared of COVID-19 actually said the reverse. They said that the person who was wearing the mask seemed more friendly, more desirable, more approachable, and would be somebody that they would better imagine themselves being intimate with, right? So in other words, this idea of disgust isn't identical for everybody. People who are the most afraid of an illness, right, they see other people who are being responsible about not being, this is an interpretation of it, right? They might see people who are being responsible about not wanting to transmit the disease or contract the disease themselves as being people who they would rather spend time with than people who weren't wearing a mask, right? So this could partially explain some of the political fallout of masking mandates and how some people were very, very upset about it. The people who were the most upset about wearing masks were often the people who felt like COVID-19 was the least scary to them, okay? They felt like it wasn't going to impact them very much at all. So those people felt like masks were bad in general, and they didn't really see they thought it was bad to wear them. But people who were more afraid of COVID-19, who were more concerned about being infected by it and what it might do to them, they had the exact opposite reaction to masking mandates and distance mandates, right? They felt like it was good to do those things, and people who were doing those things were being responsible, right? So this was some research I did a few years ago with some students using this idea of disgust and how it changes how people think about different things we might encounter in our environment. Another one, this isn't one I did directly with students. This is one that I did in collaboration with a friend, but I'm going to tell you about it anyway because it's relevant to understand the current project I have going on with students. So this project involved asking people about eating non-dairy foods, okay? So there's been a growing trend of lab-grown foods with something called precision fermentation, where essentially it uses different biotechnology techniques to create enzymes in the lab that essentially act the same as different dairy products do. So students were asked to rate different foods that were, and these students were told, or these participants were told, evaluate this, piece of cheese or piece of pizza. It's been made with dairy-free products that come from this precision fermentation, and then they were asked to do the same thing with ice cream, evaluate how much they would enjoy eating ice cream that was made with dairy-free precision fermentation foods. And what we found, again, similar to the masking example, is that the thing that most predicted how people felt is how willing they are to try new foods. So that's what this term down here, food neophobia, is. Food neophobia is this idea of being afraid of trying new foods, right? So some students and some people in general are very uninterested in trying new foods, okay? If you're uninterested in trying new food, then trying something that sounds very new and different, right? Something grown in a lab with bacteria, right? That sounds really gross to people, right? So they have a very intense negative reaction. I do not want to eat that type of pizza. I do not want to eat that type of ice cream, okay? And you can tell them, hey, everyone says it tastes just as good, just as normal as the other stuff. They're still like, nope, I don't want to do it. I sort of did a version of this experiment with my kids not that long ago. I made my kids some Impossible burgers, and then they were halfway through eating them when I said, hey, those actually aren't made out of meat. And my one son just dropped it on the plate and said, I'm full. He was just completely uninterested. He was like, next time, I want a real burger. He's my oldest. He was just like completely like, this is not cool. He was actually offended that I played the trick on him too, that I didn't tell him right away, but I guess that's just the scientist in me. So this brings us to a current project I'm doing with some students, Christina and Avery. They came to me and they wanted to do a project based on something I had taught them in my cognitive psychology class. They had been really interested in this working memory experiment. Okay, working memory is the type of memory of when you're currently thinking about something, right? That's more or less what working memory is, right? If you have to recall something that you weren't just thinking about, then that's more long-term memory. But if you're currently thinking about something, then that's working memory. So in this working memory experiment, participants are instructed to watch the screen, and I have it set up so you'll be able to see exactly what one of these trials looks like. And this is the classic version. So it basically looks like this. You see a cross, and then you see some images, and then there's this kind of waiting phase that lasts for several seconds, and then you're told where was the image on the screen that you had just, where was this on the screen, okay? What cognitive psychologists do with this is they'll do all sorts of things to try to make it easier or harder for people to remember where the thing was, right? So you don't have very much time to study it, and you just kind of have to try to remember it for that brief period of time while you're looking at the kind of mask image, right? The image that's not related to the experiment, but is just kind of like, almost like a mild distractor, and then you have to recall where it was, okay? So there's all sorts of experiments which have tried to modify how good or how well people can remember where things are in that type of an array, okay? So my students and I were talking about disgust and how disgust could modify how well people remember things in an array. So the idea that we had, and that we have literally just launched today this experiment after setting it up for several weeks, is instead of just having people look at images like a star, we thought we would make a display of food items, and we thought we would tell our participants that one of the food items is made of lab-grown ingredients, okay? So similar to the other experiment, the participants are going to be looking at some food which they believe is kind of like the normal type of food that they might have eaten growing up. And then one of the pieces of food is actually made from this new bacteria-grown ingredient, right? So this new, potentially disgusting thing, okay? So the hypothesis is that participants will have better memory for the new food item, right? In other words, what we're interested in is seeing if we can activate participants' disgust, and if that will make their memory for the thing better, right? Because they don't want to accidentally, the idea would be like, I don't want to accidentally select to eat the thing that's gross, so that I think is gross. So I want to remember the thing extra. I want to do extra well at remembering where that was. So that would look like this. We would show them a series of images of different types of milk, for example. One of the trials is milk, another one is ice cream, right? And we tell them, oh, you know, some of these are the type of milk you might have drunk when you were growing up, and then one of them is made with bacteria fermented milk, right? It comes from these products that were developed in a lab using bacteria and other microbes, and then we give them something similar that I just showed you. You see a cross, and then the image is on a display, and then there's kind of this mask image, and then at the end of it, it says, what position was this glass, okay? And so again, the idea is that this was the one, by the way, that was that I had indicated was made out of the fermented products, right? The idea is that when participants are asked about this particular item, their memory should be better. So they should do a better job of recalling this item than they would the others. And so they're going to do this over a number of trials, and then at the end of it, we'll hope that this one will be the one that the participants remember the most, right? So yeah, that's the current project that my students and I just launched. They're really, really excited about it. One of my favorite things with students is when you see them move from kind of like they're working on something because it's a project that you are telling them that's interesting, and they kind of shift all of a sudden to being like, no, I'm interested in this because it's my project now. I've heard these two students in particular say multiple times, this is our project. The one of them told me that she was having a dream that we collected all of our data and none of our data was working good. And I was like, yes, you're becoming invested, right? This is perfect. So it's just great to see, right? I absolutely love it. Some other projects, one of these I was hoping to run with a student this semester, but she kind of became uninterested kind of at the last minute, which is fine. We try to get our students interested in in projects that we're interested in and not force them to do stuff that they're uninterested in, right? So one of the options that I have, that I had expressed was the idea of using the similar discussed idea, right? Interviewing students after they visit the student cafeteria. One thing I notice from students is they always tell me that there's nothing to eat at the cafeteria. And I always find that so shocking. And I'll say, well, what do you get? I had one student say, I get a turkey sandwich every single day. And I would say, well, other than the sandwich area, there's also a salad bar. There's a pizza section that does not just pizza, but calzones and pizza sticks. There's kind of more American food. There's a place for Asian food. There's a place for, that tries to stop, allergen contaminations from getting in the food. There's lots of different options. And usually the response I get is, yeah, it all looks gross to me. One proposal I had that I thought might go along with this discussed idea is, what if people's memory of the stuff in their cafeteria, right? If they find some things disgusting, right, then that's probably what they think everything else is like in the cafeteria, right? So I had this idea for students to interview people who had just finished coming out of the cafeteria, just finished eating, and say, hey, what do you remember that was offered today? What else was available? And my guess is that if they paid attention to anything, it'll probably be the stuff that was disgusting to them, right? A lot of students don't really want to eat fish, right? I'll say, oh, you should try they had fish today, you should try the fish. And I always get, no, I'm not gonna try that. My guess is that if they see that fish is available on the one side of the cafeteria, they're like, no, I'm just gonna go get my sandwich like usual. I'm not even gonna consider it, right? But maybe if there's something like mac and cheese, they'll go wandering over there, right? So my guess would be that students, when they notice something gross, it kind of highlights their experience of being in the cafeteria for that day, and they don't really pay attention to all the other options, and they just want the safest thing that they can think of. So I'm interested in generating a kind of survey that would try to capture that experience of the disgusting things feeling like that's all that's available, even though there's plenty of other options. And then the last thing I'll tell you about is that there's one other area that I haven't really talked about disgust. It has to do with moral disgust. a very similar part of our brain, our insula, actually activates. If I was to ask you to imagine a loved one of yours committing a violent crime or like killing somebody, it actually causes that same part of your insula to activate, right? So the same part of your brain that's responsible for making you feel like, ooh, that food looks gross, or ooh, that person looks sick, maybe I shouldn't go near them today, right? Your body has a similar feeling as when you think about somebody doing something morally reprehensible. So I've tried to do some things in the past with students where we develop some type of morality questionnaire, and the idea would be to have the students do interviews where they ask people, well, imagine a friend made this decision, and how would that make you feel about your friend? We tried to do something with it a few years ago, and it didn't really work out that well, so I didn't want to present on that today, but I'm hoping to do more with that in the future, because it's another area of this research that I think could be quite interesting to investigate. So anyway, I wanted to leave time to open it up for questions. That's all I have prepared to talk about today, but if anybody has any questions, I guess one last thing that I don't really have a slide for is that one of the things we do in the psychology department, when I'm talking about doing these projects with students, this is something that we do every single year, is we try to get students interested in working on projects, and we have them present not only at the research symposium at Manchester, but the psych department actually takes all of our students to Chicago. There's a professional psychology conference every single year. Marcy, the name of the hotel is escaping. The Palmer House Hilton. It's at the Palmer House Hilton every spring in Chicago. We always take a group of students there. I think the least we've had since I've been there has been like 10, and at most it's been over 20. And it's just a great time seeing all of our students doing these research projects that they chose to do, right? I'm not telling any students, hey, you need to study disgust, right? I tell them some options, and then I will get students who go, oh, that sounds kind of interesting to me, let's talk more about it. And then they take these ideas that we give them, and we come up with a project with them, and then they take it to a professional conference, and they get to talk to other psychologists about it. It's one of the most gratifying things I've ever done in my career. And I just wanted to highlight that and how proud all of us in the psychology department are of our students. Marcy and Rusty are here as well, so that's why I'm gesturing over there for everybody. But yeah, does anybody have any questions or thoughts or anything? Yeah.
Clear back at the beginning, you had that the leg of intellect and emotions.
Yeah.
And I would feel that both of those things are very, very important in tandem. And so if you're going to get really good, you can go by your intellect and you can really miss it bad. And so it's those in tandem seem to be the ideal to have the right kind of thing, is because partly why I say that is I do think emotions are looked down on more than they should be.
No, I would completely agree with you, right? The sentiment I get from most students is focusing on, well, emotions are obviously not how I should be thinking. And something I try to talk to them about is that we shouldn't ever ignore your emotions, right? You shouldn't just completely fly by the seat of your pants. I'm angry today, and just have that be how you make your decisions. But if you're having, it's become much more common today that students, just people in general are more interested in thinking about their mental health, right? Like, we have more athletes than ever who are saying, like, something really weird is going on. I've been really anxious. I'm going to sit out, right? Simone Biles famously sat out one Olympics, right? Because she was experiencing a lot of stress, right? So she was noticing this really dire emotional state that she was in, and instead of potentially, landing and breaking her ankle and ruining her career, she very wisely said, look, I could still have multiple more years of good competition, and I'm sure it really was awful to make that decision, but she found a way to make it. Naomi Osaka was another famous, she's a tennis player who made a similar decision. She wasn't appreciating all the stress she had of being a high-performing tennis player, so she took some time away from the sport, right? A thing that years ago people would have said, you'd have to be crazy to do that, right? But now she's come back and she's performing really well again. So yeah, being aware of how you're feeling and how that could impact your decision making, but then also still trying to, well, what's actually the best choice? Let's really think through this and make sure we're not making a bad decision. It is some middle ground there. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a couple things I thought of as you went through it.
Yeah.
One would deal with the basic first graph, dealing with intellectual versus emotional interactions being negatively correlated, and you get a real nice straight line. But either can work, and it might be that an individual settles into a pattern which leads them to the most convenient, comfortable decision in the least time. You don't spend a lot of time thinking about it because you've had an emotional response, and it worked in the past. You do it again. It makes you feel good to eat potato chips in spite of what the doctor says.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's convenience that leads to consistency in patterns. And I noticed on this, the milk study. The only glass with a straw is the one that you labeled as inducing disgust because it was made with artificial bacterial enzymes. It's also, I think, the only glass that was textured, but I can't remember that for sure. But the biases like that can shift.
I don't
data.
know. I don't believe that that's the. I don't believe that those are the exact 4 images that we're using.
Okay.
We've been changing it a little bit more this weekend. But yeah, that was something else that we had been talking about, is how to try to control it and make sure that it wasn't just like, one of the glasses has this feature and that makes it stand out more, and that's how I'm going to remember what that one is. Yeah.
Experimental design is difficult to make neutral.
Yeah, exactly. As far as I've been able to tell, I don't know if anybody has tried to do this type of working memory task using food items in this particular way. There's some things we're doing, like counterbalancing, where we show them certain things in different orders, and so we're trying out some things. It very well might not work. I think the research question we have is a strong one, but it's just fine-tuning it to figure out, the best way to ask the question and the best materials to show our participants.
And I think another issue that can drive responses is hormonal levels in the body. Mm-hmm. And many things change your, hormonal output. And the hormonal output is going to have an effect on behavior, and it'll have an effect on the physiological impact that often is interpreted as emotional. The tendency to tear, breathe differently, tense up, triggered by a couple hormones.
Yeah.
And our understanding of the realm of, the breadth of the realm of responses to a particular hormone is pretty limited. And it will not be the same between any 2 individuals. So many things, if you eat something and it's too hot, it's going to trigger physiological responses. Hormones are going to change, and that's going to affect you in the future. And trying to separate out the underlying biology, if the food is slimy, the textural differences, the chewing patterns will change, and it's going to have some effect on hormones, which are going to be hard to measure. But I don't think you can pretend that they're not there.
Yeah.
And the hormonal effects can be memorable. And the result is you remember that day you got sick because it induced vomiting and a bunch of hormonal changes that were really not nice, and you'll never eat green peppers again.
Yeah.
That was my example.
That's actually a very common experience that people will report is, I ate at that restaurant, and then that night I felt really sick, right?
And I discovered it really was. I did get sick. It had nothing at all to do with the green peppers.
It very rarely does.
But that taste triggers that response.
Yeah.
Still.
Yeah, that's not
not favored.
surprising. Yeah, because, you know, from the chart that I had up, right, like, you know, if you had some type of episode like that with vomiting or just some type of severe sickness or stomach ache, and the last flavor that you can remember, right, it is going to trigger some type of learning response where you're now going to think, well, maybe those two things are quite connected, even though you could understand logically that they're not. It's still hard not to feel like that there was a connection there, right? Maybe we shouldn't go back to that particular Chinese restaurant because of our last experience. You know, usually there's another better explanation. Almost always there's another explanation for why people got sick. They had some other type of contact with a virus or bacteria, or something they'd eaten the day before was the culprit, but the closer thing gives them the reaction, and they usually tie it to that.
And I think my last comment would center on an alternative way of thinking, perhaps. I got the impression from the title that we were linking together emotional response to decision patterns. And there's also, I think, a strong possibility that decision patterns are stereotypical responses to situations because of the social environment the individual's in, the clique they're in, the feedback they get based on their behavior patterns, so they keep doing the same thing to maintain membership in that clique and not be an outsider to that group. So you could call it an emotional response to the social environment, or just stereotypical simplifying life. If a decision has worked well for you in the past, you do it again and again and again, and you don't analyze it anymore. You do it because it's worked. And stereotypical behavior works because patterns repeat themselves.
Yeah.
And I think emotional patterns can be learned that way, that kind of behavior makes you feel good. It raises your adrenal level, and you get aggressive over certain issues. You push a button, and everybody in your group responds the same way, because that's the button that's supposed to make you angry and really, really ticked off.
Yeah, you know, yeah. There is definitely there can very much be a cultural element of our emotional response. For example, you know, it's sometimes common for certain cultures to have a stereotype of anger is very common in this culture. I had a friend who would sometime, when I was in high school, who would sometimes have these very explosive, angry outbursts. And a couple of times when I would ask him about it, he'd be like, "Oh, you know, it's just because I'm Italian," or whatever, right? Like, and that had been a story that had been told in his family for years, right? Italians are hot-headed. It's okay if you get angry, right? So it creates this kind of like positive feedback loop of, well, look, I got angry, but that's just part of who I am, right? And then there's no real confrontation of how that emotion was treated and how you used it, so it perpetuates itself, right? There's no need to change. It feels like it was useful in the time, right? My dad was always that way. He always said it's because we're Italian that we're that way, right? It just becomes like a story that we tell about, I'm not trying to pick on Italians, but yeah, that can definitely be a part of it. You know, but yeah, I agree with you. You know, my kids, I try to make sure that my wife really doesn't like fish, and I try to eat. You know, sometimes when we go to a restaurant, I'll specifically get a fish item because I want my kids to see somebody eating fish. And I'm not trying to make my wife feel bad that she doesn't like it, although sometimes I'll tease her about it. But I often will just say, like, I want our kids to see people eating fish because I want them to think that it's something that they should try, right? So yes, I would agree with you that, you know, if you came from a family, you know, relaying it more to disgust. If you came from a family where it was very uncommon that you ate any fish, or you were never offered the opportunity to try it, it just seemed like a thing that was really alien to your family, then it's not going to be a thing that you really are ever interested in engaging in, right? You're never going to try to go past that. You know, fish look kind of gross and slimy in real life, so I don't want to eat that, right? My kids were freaking out the other day because we got I got snails at a restaurant, and they didn't realize that was even an option for somebody to eat. So
I don't
yeah.
know where you got that.
Well, this was when we were in Florida. That was when we were in Florida, actually. I got some escargot. It was quite tasty. Nice garlic sauce and some nice baguette. It was great. But yeah, my kids thought, they were like, I can't believe you're eating that. But no, I do, if they don't have the experience to see somebody eating it, right? And that's another element of this experiment that I didn't really get to talk about, is there is an element of, we're asking people about the types of food they get exposed to as well. And so what we're expecting is that people who say that they're exposed to more foods will probably be less likely to feel disgusted, but people who are exposed to fewer foods will probably feel more disgust. And we've seen that in other research that we've done too. So yeah, very nice comments. Hopefully I addressed or commented on at least some of them. Yeah.
So my question is, what kinds of careers do students who study cognitive neuropsychology, or careers or graduate programs, do they go to?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we, I mean, occasionally I do get some students who are very interested in doing what I do. Sometimes they feel very interested in going into some type of academics or doing research. So if that's the case, then, you know, I make sure that they understand there's going to be a lot of graduate school in your future. Oftentimes students, they just really enjoy learning about the kind of the brain stuff that I talk about, some of it I talked about with you today, and they are just most interested in that. Even though their ultimate goal would not necessarily be to work with it, they're just really fascinated about learning about that part of, you know, how that element of psychology works on their eventual path to doing like therapy or whatever else they're interested in. So it's really, you know, I try to tailor it as much to the individual student as much as possible. If a student tells me, I really want to take the cognitive neuroscience major, I always say, well, what do you want to do with it? And then we usually have a little bit of a conversation about, you know, where their interests lie. It tends to be people that are a little bit more interested in the hard sciences, but they're also, there's something about psychology that just is very appealing to them. And that was always something that I felt, is a little bit more interest in the hard sciences, but still liking one of the softer sciences like psychology. So it, you know, it still opens the door for a lot of our students to go into many careers in psychology that they would get from any of the other majors, but it just, usually they pick it if there's just something about the brain and learning about the brain that speaks to them. Yeah, sometimes they're a little bit more interested in medicine or going into some type of medical career, but not always.
The whole thing of interrelating with people, it seems like psychology should have a whole lot of input on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I've noticed with almost everyone I talk to at Manchester, is they really do a lot of one-on-one time with all of their students, where they try to allow for as much of that as possible. Yeah, I really want the students to feel like they had, that their time was worthwhile, even if they're not going to go on to study the brain, right? Like specifically, I want to, you know, I would rather them take the major because they're interested in it and they have some other idea of what to do with it than just, I'm taking this because I'm interested in it. So that's something that I try to bring to the equation as well, is making sure that they have some idea of where they want to take it. They might not know exactly, but they have some ideas, and you know, I just try to encourage them to think more about it and see where they might fit in. I have one student who's just got accepted to a master's program in speech language pathology, right? So she's going from a psychology degree to that, right? And so she's going to have to spend a semester taking some courses that she didn't get with us, but she's still very excited and interested in it, and she said a lot of that interest came from studying psychology. So yeah, there's all kinds.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCoy.
Oh,
This
thank
has
you.
been
Thanks for having me.
fascinating.